Okay, I'm going to leave this up here while I speak for anyone who needs help putting on the closed captions. All right. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Historic Richmond's virtual program on life inside a slave house. We are so grateful to people like you who attend our programs, support our work, and care about our historic places. We particularly would like to thank our sponsors, Dominion Energy and TCV Trust and Wealth Management, for supporting our programs. Tonight's program is being recorded and it'll be available on our website next week. I am Danielle Porter, Director of Preservation Services at Historic Richmond. For those of you who do not know us, Historic Richmond is a nonprofit with a mission to shape the future of Richmond by preserving our distinctive historic character, sparking revitalization, and championing our past and future architectural legacy. Last summer, we hosted a panel discussion on documenting slave houses with Elvatry Spelches, Joby Hill, and Doug Sanford. Some of you may have attended that, and if not, you can find that on our website as well. The focus of that panel discussion was the challenges of documenting slave housing, which was one of the most common building types in our country, and that the limited number of buildings remaining make it all the more important that we document them so that Black history, American history, is not lost forever. Following the positive response of the program, as well as a few leads on potential undocumented slave houses in Richmond, Doug suggested that we explore a discussion on the interior spaces, features, and finishes of slave houses, with a focus on the types of spaces and conditions that enslaved people faced, but also altered to their own purpose. Tonight, we will go beyond the brick and mortar discussion of slave houses, since many of those buildings would have been built at the discretion of a white owner, and look at the archaeological and historic evidence of the choices that the enslaved did make regarding how they lived within those buildings, how they spent their limited free time, and in some cases, where they even chose to live. Preservation is more than just buildings, it's people and places. We have already received several questions asking if the correct term is slave house or enslaved house. Slave house is the term that has been used by many academics to describe any house or building occupied by an enslaved person during the period of slavery. During our previous panel, Joby Hill further expanded on this, that slave house is also inclusive of buildings in which housing for an enslaved person was one of the functions, because it would have been common for enslaved people to work and live in the same area. So in that sense, we're going beyond and including kitchens and other outbuildings. But we welcome further discussion on this, and we'll save plenty of time at the end for questions. And if you do have a question, whether it's on this particularly or what one of the speakers are doing, if you could insert it through the Q&A feature, I will still see what you send in through the chat feature, but it'll be easier at the end to go through them in the Q&A feature. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. All right, Anna Edwards. Anna is a Richmond-based public historian. As chair of the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project of the Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality since 2004, she has worked to preserve and expand understanding of the early African and African American history of Richmond, Virginia. One of the group's goals is to establish a 9-acre Shockoe Bottom Memorial Park containing sites of the free and enslaved Black life in the 18th century, as well as the city's role as the epicenter of the domestic slave trade in the 18th and 19th century. Other research interests include the early American and African Atlantic world, historic preservation, land use, social justice, memory, and identity. The group partnered with the Library of Virginia in 2019 to present Truth and Conciliation in the 400th year, a public history symposium. Anna holds a bachelor's degree in visual arts and a master's degree in history with an emphasis on public history, and is currently the education program manager at the American Civil War Museum. Crystal O'Connor. Crystal is the Archaeological Field Research Manager at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, located in Charlottesville. Over the past 8 years, she has been busy running fieldwork at the Joiner's Shop, North Dependency, South Pavilion and South Wing, Stone Stables, and field quarter sites off of the mountaintop, among others. Her research interest includes the African diaspora, landscape archaeology, consumerism, and plantations. Her master's degree is from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. And last but not least, Douglas Sanford. Doug has 40 years experience in archaeology and historic preservation, and over 20 years in the Department of Historic Preservation at the University of Mary Washington. His research in the Department of in the study of 18th and 19th century historic sites, plantation, and African-American archaeology in the Chesapeake region, and the architecture of the enslaved African Americans in Virginia. Since 2010, he has served as the co-director of the Virginia Slave Housing Project, a research endeavor focusing on the documentation, interpretation, and preservation of slave-related buildings. All right, so to start, we have a polling question, and there is no right or wrong answer. Let's see. And I will give about 20 to 30 seconds for responses. All right, I'm gonna give five more seconds. Okay, so you should be able to see the responses, and it looks like about 90% of the people who responded said they have been inside a slave house. All right, so Doug, I am going to share the screen with you. Hang on one second. Yes, Doug, you should have control of it right now, and can just hit the arrow to get to your first slide.
I'm not seeing it.
It's just okay. Use your mouse to click. See if that
there
works.
We go.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you and good evening. And my goal here for the evening is to use 70 buildings from the Virginia Slave Housing Project to characterize the domestic interior rooms of slave housing. And I hope architecturally sort of set the stage for other two speakers to fill out these spaces. And let's see. Okay. And here's the game plan for this evening. So I want to set out the cultural context for slave housing and address some issues of the physical survival of these buildings. And then I'll first characterize rooms, domestic rooms from rural buildings, then do the same for rooms from urban buildings, and then talk about some of the interior modifications by enslaved people that we see inside these buildings. And there we go. So we should expect a great diversity of slave housing in that the slavery was an institution that lasted for over 250 years and encompassed a wide variety of regions. But we also see variation in these buildings as to their size, the materials that you see listed there, the degree of investment that enslavers put into these buildings. But also keep in mind, I won't be addressing this specifically, but that the term slave housing incorporates spaces within enslavers' houses, such as attics and basements and spare rooms. I will be addressing this next point that outbuildings that had other functions, like kitchens and laundries and stables, did have quartering rooms in those. I'll be referring to those as mixed-use buildings. And then you can just see some of the variety of terms we use for cabins, quarters, barracks, etc. and buildings that were both obviously in rural and urban areas. In terms of the cultural context, I hope people will think about these buildings and their interiors as those of conflicting intentions, that this was a constant dynamic of power and negotiation between enslavers and enslaved people. We know that enslaved people negotiated for better housing, better food, opportunities to live with their family and members of their relatives. You can see these buildings in part, this is what I mean by conflicting intentions, as from the enslaver's point of view, as buildings of attempted domination and control, of oppression. But oppositely, enslaved people made these into places of cultural survival, resistance to slavery. And in that larger sense, think about these buildings as being bicultural or creolized. That's, for instance, enslavers would control typically the size of these buildings, their placement on the landscape, the type of materials used. But the enslaved residents obviously brought their own cultural sensibilities to the interiors, as to their food, their clothing, their possessions. And in that sense, these were spaces that they used to promote Black families, Black communities, and Black culture. As to physical survival, we really are limited over time. So for instance, we have no standing buildings from the 17th century, only archaeological sites. There's only a handful from the 18th century. All of the examples I'm using this evening are from the 19th century. So from 1820 to 1860. The most common type of slave housing, log cabins, covers the 18th, 19th century. And again, we have very few of these surviving. If you look at the lower right photograph, that one room type of structure with a dirt floor, a wooden mud chimney, a little loft up above. So that was the most common type, but we have few surviving. And obviously after the period of slavery, enslaved people's possessions, furniture, et cetera, would have been removed from these people. And obviously if the buildings survive into the modern era, they become changed by later occupants and owners. And in some cases, the interior modifications in the modern era are quite extensive. So it's usually sort of definitely a detective piece of work to see what survived from the period of slavery. Turning to rural buildings, we have 59 of these I'm using. You can see they come in different types of materials. You see there, so a nice spread of log frame. You'll see that the biggest group is bricks. So guess what? Those were the best able to survive physically, so we see more of them. We see different formats, cabins, kitchen quarters that I'll talk about, other types. The three image you see here is a very common variety. So you can see it's 64% of the rural buildings, what were known as duplexes or double quarters. And these were buildings that were intentionally established to house two enslaved households. So if you look at that lower left image, there's two exterior doors. The central chimney provided a fireplace to each room, but there were partitions downstairs and upstairs to divide these rooms and spaces from communicating with one another. And so we see these duplexes, guess what? They're larger, they're better built, and they tend to be located near the main house, which again, somewhat explains their survival. Looking at these rooms, there's 154 rooms in these buildings. All of them except two have wooden floors. We did find a couple that have wooden floors. They range greatly in room sizes. So I won't go through all these numbers, but anything from as small as 7 by 13 feet to almost 20 feet square. The average of 230 square feet, that's a room that's about 15 by 15. It turns out that's pretty reliable. But I said overall, these are larger rooms from these more substantial buildings, but there is a range. If you look at that upper right image, that's a small log building with 146 square feet. Here's to the lower left is a log room that is right at the average, and then a much larger room in a brick duplex. In terms of heating, we see mostly fireplaces, but what's interesting about the antebellum period, we do start to see some buildings that were designed to have stoves. Stoves sometimes get added later, including after the period of slavery, but we do see some wood stoves in these buildings, but largely it's fireplaces. I'm distinguishing here between primary rooms, and these are largely the rooms downstairs, but sometimes if you have a kitchen downstairs, the primary domestic room is upstairs. But all but two of these primary rooms were heated, where in contrast, the secondary rooms, and these are typically upstairs, so things like garrets, lofts, or attics, you'll notice that 75% of these are unheated. And this is a real pattern that we see, that these secondary rooms receive less treatment and are rougher spaces that enslaved people had to endure. In terms of the walls and ceilings of these rooms, again, there's a wide variety of treatments used, but the most common is whitewash. It's also the cheapest. So, majority in this case of the walls had whitewash, and it goes on log, as you see in that lower left picture, but it goes on brick, it goes on stone, it goes on exposed framing, etc. And there's another group that has plaster walls. And so if you look at that middle image and ignore that later green paint and look below the window, you'll see the original brick wall with remnants of the original plaster on there. Also notice in both these categories, there were unfinished rooms. They had no finished treatment at all. And when you look at ceilings, again, whitewash is the most common. And then plaster, lath and plaster on the ceiling is the second group. So as I said, within these rural buildings, secondary rooms really stand out. These garrets and lofts, I said, they're often unheated and they're often unfinished. So the room to the left, in the lower left image, there's an example of an unfinished room. They obviously have less headroom, they're poorly lit, they're poorly ventilated. So I said, very rough conditions that enslaved people had to endure in these types of spaces. Turning to urban buildings, there's a much smaller sample. As I said, unfortunately, Virginia's cities and towns have been less studied architecturally in terms of slave housing. So I have 11 buildings to work with. These tend to be smaller buildings. You're dealing with narrow lots in Virginia cities. Also, definitely more brick construction. That's partly due to Virginia cities early on establishing fire prevention codes, calling for brick construction. There's definitely more mixed use buildings. Again, I mean by that slave housing combined with some other use. So all three of the buildings you're looking at here all have kitchens on the first floor, and then the primary domestic rooms are upstairs. So examples of what we call mixed use. And we know from historic documents, census records, etc., in most cases, we're looking at smaller enslaved households, 1 to 3 people, often, and I said in many cases, female-based households. Again, sort of doing the same. Here's building materials. You'll notice brick is the dominant material, 55%, and there's hardly any log buildings amongst this sample. So in the upper left image, that's a kitchen quarter at the Mary Washington House in Fredericksburg, and underneath that siding, its amazing survival, is a log building. We see again duplexes once again. There's one in the lower image in Petersburg, where you'll notice the dominance of kitchen quarters like this one in the brick one from Fredericksburg. I said those really do become the most common type of mixed-use slave housing we see in urban areas. Looking at room sizes and heating, again, won't run to the numbers, but definitely a smaller range and a smaller average size for urban buildings. So about 200 square feet, a room, say 12 by 17. Most, but not all of the primary rooms in this case were heated. The left image has a fireplace that's been filled in with brick, but that's a upstairs room from a kitchen. Here's another one to the right. That's a smaller fireplace, again, upstairs from the kitchen. And if you want to call it that, better than rural secondary rooms, these upstairs garrets and lofts, but again, half of them are unheated. And here's an example from Fredericksburg. I'll say, I forgot to mention this in the previous slide, but many of these secondary spaces in urban areas, we do not know the original treatment. These obviously are buildings that survived into the modern era, and later changes have obscured us from seeing what were the original finishes. Oh, so here's that exact point. So you'll notice, as before, whitewash and plaster on the walls and ceilings. That tends to be very common. You'll see plaster and lath here in the right photograph. But again, almost half of the ceilings of the buildings we're looking at, we can't tell the original ceiling treatment. It's just been so changed by modern occupants. And for instance, this is the upstairs room, the quartering room for that kitchen quarter at the Mary Washington House that I showed you earlier. And getting to modifications to the interior spaces by enslaved people, we know slaves had the means that, and obviously the ability to add on later wall treatments, so further layers of whitewash or paint or other coverings like wallpaper or newspaper. So if you look at that left image, this is a brick building in Fredericksburg. There's an original plaster on the wall with whitewash, then later coats of whitewash and a later coat of paint. We also see a variety of nails, spikes, hooks, and wooden pegs used by enslaved people for hanging a variety of objects, their clothing, tools, their possessions, perhaps food, or if they're drying herbs, something like that. So if you look carefully at this image on the right, this is a brick duplex, but there's a wooden, what we call a nailer, a wooden member inserted into the brick, and there were a series of pegs along that nailer that the enslaved residents could use for their purposes. Other modifications include closets. We do not have a large number of these. We see little closets below stairs. And if you look at that image to the upper right, there's a very substantial closet, in this case next to the fireplace. So this white cloth hanging above these metal buckets, that's the fireplace behind that cloth. And so here's the closet to the left of the fireplace. A really intriguing example, we only have one, is of a later interior partition. So in this lower photograph where I'm taking this picture from, I have my back to the central partition up in the garret. So this used to be one room. And then later in time, it was further divided when they added this partition, this wooden partition that you see with the whitewash on it. So again, it speaks to the crowding of these spaces and also the conditions where enslaved people would have to just go through other people's rooms to get to their space, but trying to create a little bit of privacy in this instance. And then last, we do see what archaeologists tend to call subfloor pits. So these are storage pits below the level of the floors. Archaeologists see a much greater variety of sizes and purposes for these, whereas the couple we've seen architecturally are pretty definitely root cellars, or so these are storage pits for food. The two we've seen, or three we've seen, are larger, they're brick lined, and they're right in front of the hearths of kitchens. But again, where slaves could have stored food and other possessions. And in closing, I would just like to say that the Virginia Slave Housing Project has cooperated with Encyclopedia Virginia, located in Charlottesville, Virginia, to do photography of these many slave dwellings and to make them available on their website. So if you go to the Encyclopedia Virginia website, click on virtual tours, you'll see a wide variety of buildings, but also a number of slave dwellings, and you can click and drag on these and in that sense tour around the exterior and interiors of these buildings. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Doug. We have a polling question right here. Do you think that most enslaved people acquired their possessions from their owners or as consumers at markets? And let me pull up. All right, and I'll give people a minute to do that. And it's been pointed out to me that the attendees only see the person who is speaking, not the entire panel. And I apologize, but I don't know how to change that. So if someone wants to type in to the chat with how to do that, I can change it. If not, we can just leave it as is. But I'm going to end this poll right now and share the results. So pretty much it's almost split slightly more towards owner as to what the audience thought, but it actually, I'm going to let Crystal answer that as she talks about the reconstruction of Mulberry Row and what we know about the lives who were enslaved, the lives of those who were enslaved at Monticello, and she can talk more about how they acquired their possessions. So, Crystal, you should have control of the screen now, and you can use your mouse to click to the next slide. Oh, sorry, we got more polling questions. Hang on. Have you ever visited Monticello? Let's see. All right. Okay, everyone answered real fast. Everyone has either been or hopes to go soon. And then we have one more question. Have you been since Mulberry Row was reconstructed? And surprising, or I'm surprised. I think it's great that 64% of you have been more recently than not just as children. All right. Crystal, you should still have control to keep going. There you go.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to Historic Richmond for hosting this panel. It's exciting to be here and sharing the screen with Doug and Anna. I've learned a lot from Doug already, and I'm looking forward to what Anna has to say here in a bit. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what the interior of these spaces looked like and what sorts of objects were inside of them based on the archaeological record. And since I work at Monticello, we're going to talk about Monticello examples in particular. Some takeaways, though, that I'm hoping to leave with you throughout the course of the talk. So Thomas Jefferson did not allot his enslaved people many of their personal possessions. Ooh, audio unclear. I'm going to keep talking, but if there's audio issues, just give a holler. So Thomas Jefferson did not allot enslaved people many of their personal possessions. In fact, that we know they were active producers and consumers. They were selling goods to the main house and earning coins to go to market with on Sundays. There's also a large variability among enslaved households in their selection of goods. So we're going to take a look at some of the variety of objects and the types of objects that are in these spaces. Something important to remember is that archaeology is another really important independent source of evidence, and it just doesn't fill in the gaps of the documentary or the architectural records. So we have really important research questions that we can ask based on the artifact assemblages that we can then kind of triangulate and look at the documentary record and the architectural record to use in conjunction. And then finally, some enslaved households managed to gain more control over their circumstances than others. But again, remember, this is all within the confines of slavery. So whatever control they managed was at their enslaver's discretion, and all control evaporated, at least here at Monticello, at his death in 1826, when enslaved people were sold off of the property to make up for his debts. Okay, so I'm so excited that a lot of you have been to Monticello. So you'll know that it's the home of Thomas Jefferson. It was a 5,000 acre working plantation. So this is a working farm. Jefferson enslaved over 607 people during the course of his lifetime. Many lived on the Monticello farm. He also had other properties in Virginia where some of these people lived. Many people at Monticello lived along Mulberry Row, which is, you can see the vegetable garden kind of in the center right of the screen. Mulberry Row is just to the left of that. So at any given point in time at Monticello, there would have been between 80 and 120 people living and working, and Mulberry Row is kind of the center of that industry. So many of the people lived on Mulberry Row. A couple of the sites that I'm going to be talking about, our orientation has changed a little bit, but the mansion is right there, still in the middle of the screen. There are some houses, some domestic quarters that were along Mulberry Row, which are no longer standing. A couple of them have been reconstructed, but we have Building O, Building E, and Buildings R, S, and T. And these were identified by Jefferson in a document in which he described them. People that were living at Monticello, but who were not on the mountaintop, were living off of the mountaintop at other sites. So this map is showing a few of the other sites that I'm going to be talking about over the next couple of minutes. The mansion is right there, sort of in the middle left. And then there are enslaved people living along Mulberry Row. Site 6 is home to 3 cabins where enslaved agricultural workers were living and working. Elizabeth Hemings is another quarter of an enslaved woman. And then Site 17 and Stuart Watkins are both home to free white workmen. Okay, Doug did a great job describing some of these cabins. This is a reconstructed Building T located along Mulberry Row. So we're going to be using artifact assemblages from this area to talk about how these spaces were filled. So how do archaeologists kind of get started filling these spaces? Well, we looked at the documentary record first. It's a good place to start. Jefferson doesn't actually describe the interiors of these spaces. We know where some are located on the mountaintop. We have very little evidence of where sites are located off of the mountaintop. But in any case, one of the reminiscence we have sort of filling this space a little bit better is from one of Jefferson's granddaughters in 1889. She describes the interior of Building T, which was the home of John and Priscilla Hemings. She describes that, "I remember the appearance of the interior of that cabin, the position of the bed with its white counterpane, which is just a bedspread, and ruffled pillowcases, and of the little table with its clean white cloth, and a shelf over it on which stood an old-fashioned bandbox, which is a box for a hat, with wallpaper covering representing dogs running." And so this is it. This is all that we know about the interior of any cabin located at Monticello. It's not a lot to go off of, right? But at least it's a start. So what else do we know from the documentary record that we can start to make some inferences about? We can look to Jefferson's documents. He kept pretty detailed records of rations that he issued to his enslaved workers. We have evidence for a rations list from 1796. He includes fish in it. There's a bread list from 1810. He issued blankets every 3 years. He occasionally would issue a bed. He issued clothing for cloth for making clothes. He would issue stockings, shoes every 3 years. And again, this is sort of it. So how do we fill these spaces as archaeologists? Well, let's get back to building S, which is one of the cabins that we looked at on that map earlier. So this is the 1796 Mutual Assurance Plat. This is in Jefferson's hand. And on it, he describes the size of this building. He says R, which as well as S and T, are servants' houses of wood with wooden chimneys and earth floors, 12 by 14 feet each and 27 feet apart from one another. So we know that Building S was located just uphill from that reconstructed Building T. One question that we ask as archaeologists is, well, who lived here? We don't know for sure, but Building S is interesting because we suspect that a woman named Sally Hemings may have lived here. And some of you may be familiar with her name. She fathered 6 of Jefferson's children, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. So she's an elite member of the enslaved community here at Monticello. And one thing I want to point out in thinking about enslaved people trying to make these houses a home is movement across the property, even by members of the enslaved community. So somebody like Sally Hemings, upon her return from France in 1790, was moved into building E, which we looked at on the map previously. A couple of years later, she moved into either building R or building S. It was likely building S. And then about a decade later, she was moved into the South Wing. So within the course of 2 decades, she's moving to, a couple of different times. So it would have been challenging, I think, to make these spaces home for somebody who is not really permanent in one space for any given length of time. One object I do want to point out that was discovered at excavations at Building S is this French Delft jar, and this is something that is really neat. It's a jar that Sally Hemings herself may have brought back from France. We oftentimes can't associate a particular object with a person, but this is one thing that may actually be able to be associated with Sally Hemings. And again, just pointing out Sally Hemings' movement across the landscape. She was first in building E upon her return from France, and then she moved downhill to either building R or S, and then she moved back uphill into the South Wing. Okay, so building S, if you can see my mouse, it is located at the far eastern end of Mulberry Row, the foundations of which were discovered in 1983 by archaeologists. Doug was one of those archaeologists on site. They recovered over 52,000 artifacts, and a lot of those objects we're going to look at in a few minutes. Here are the foundations of Building S. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see one of the last log sills that are still in place from the cabin. This is the stone foundation. So this building was pretty well constructed. It existed from about the mid 1790s till probably about 1830. And it would have been a pretty well constructed building given its location to the mansion, to the main house. And this is just a site plan, a site map. So building S, it would have been this green outline up here. This hole in the middle that was in that last slide, this is a subfloor pit. Doug had mentioned one of these in his last slide. This is where residents would have put foodstuffs, root vegetables, things they wanted to keep dry and cool during the hot summer months. Okay, so what have we found archaeologically at these sites that sort of fill out the space and give it some depth? Well, nails are really common. So this would have held the roof together and some of the, the clapboard onto the side of the building. A lot of people are surprised when we say we found evidence of keys and locks and padlocks. This kind of tells us that enslaved people had some degree of privacy to an extent. Shutter dogs would have been a way for enslaved people to close shutters on a cabin. And window glass, we have a lot of window glass from Mulberry Row, not so much from out in the quarters off of the mountaintop. So as archaeologists, we're interested in how artifact assemblages are similar or different from one another. And one thing that's very different that we see very starkly is there's a lot more window glass on the mountaintop rather than off of the mountaintop. So there's this sort of hierarchy in living conditions, just because people along Mulberry Row had more window glass than their counterparts that lived and worked out in the agricultural fields. So what filled these spaces actually on the inside? Well, we have drawer pulls, furniture tacks. These suggest some sort of degree of furniture, right? Some furnishings, a dresser, a chest. Furniture tacks, many enslaved people would have been using stools, benches, tables that were constructed by members of the enslaved community on the property to eat, to mend by firelight. This furniture tack could suggest some sort of nicer piece of furniture that was upholstered, perhaps. An escutcheon is the key plate, perhaps on a chest or a press, into which you'd put a key to lock it. So again, suggesting some form of privacy. Jefferson also issued members of his enslaved community agricultural tools such as hoes And we found evidence of one of those hoes on the property. So let's try to make it a little bit more concrete and colorful, perhaps. This is an artifact assemblage from Site 6. This is just a very small portion of the ceramics that we recovered from that site. We have Chinese porcelain in the upper left. We have some creamware and pearlware in the right. We have stoneware in the bottom middle. At Building S, there were over, I think there were 30 different types of, 50 different types of ceramics just found at that site. So there are lots of different types of ceramics, and you can see lots of different patterns and colors that people were using and purchasing. Just within one type of ceramic, pearlware, at Building S, there are 15 different types of pearlware decorations. And I have some examples on the right-hand side of the screen showing the variety of different types of decoration. What's interesting, again, thinking about archaeologists comparing different sites, all of the sites in red are sites where enslaved people were living. And so building O, S, R, T, Elizabeth Hemings, and Site 6, you can kind of just very quickly see that there's a lot more different types of decorations. So it's kind of interesting thinking about that, there being a lot more color in these spaces than maybe some of their white free counterparts. However, if you think about it even one step further, many white free people would have had access to purchasing entire sets of ceramics. So because they had enough money to buy a set, they would have purchased a set, which is sort of the fashionable thing to do. Rather, when enslaved people went to market, they only had enough money to purchase maybe one or two ceramics at a time. So while I love the variety, it's also interesting to think about that this is really only what they had access to. There are lots of different types of vessel forms from buildings that we've excavated. I think most of these are actually from Building S. So we have bowls, chamber pots, which is a toilet, mugs, jugs, tea bowls, saucers, storage jars, and more bowls. There are 28 different types of vessels at Building S in and of itself. So people are really using a wide variety of vessel forms. This is a Chinese porcelain plate from Building S. So this is an object that Sally Hemings herself may have used and left behind when she was moved to the South Wing. She may have dropped it and broken it. These ceramics are really fragile and they just break into a million pieces when you drop them, even on a dirt floor. But I love the detail. So this is hand painted and this would have come from China. And it's amazing, just the care that went into producing these objects. So other things that would have filled these cabins, many of these activities would have taken place outside, particularly during the warmer months. But thinking again, what is in these cabins at any given point in time. So there's objects associated with games. There's dominoes and marbles. There's part of a folding rule. So we know that people, again, were in charge of sort of building their own furniture. A folding rule may have helped build one of these stools that an enslaved person was sitting on. Pocket knives. Jaw harps are a type of musical instrument that people would have put in their mouths and plucked and created a tone. So we have lots of jaw harps from sites at Monticello. Pipe bowls. This is the part of the pipe you would have stuffed the tobacco into. And then slate pencils and writing slate. So teaching enslaved people to read and write was not illegal until after 1831 with Nat Turner's Rebellion. But these objects are just really interesting to me because they invoke, these enslaved people are able to read and write. So Jefferson did not provide enough dietary variety or calories for people throughout their work week. A peck of cornmeal, a half a pound of pork, and 4 salted fish were all that Jefferson provided enslaved people each week. And so enslaved people were had to look to things like gardening, hunting, fishing, trapping for adding calories and variety to their diet. Different objects that we have speak to some of those tasks. There's gunflint, lead shot, fishing hooks, all of which kind of speak to those other activities that were taking place. Utensils, forks, knives, spoons, I'll speak to eating and animal bone. We don't have great preservation of animal bone at Monticello, but we know that enslaved people were keeping things like chickens in order to help supplement their diet. More eating and drinking objects, we have wine bottle glass. So these are sort of like the Nalgene bottles or the hydro flasks of the day. Wine bottle glasses everywhere at Monticello. There's tumbler bases, pharmaceutical bottles, stemware. So all of these are actually from either Site 6 or Building S. So these are all sites associated with enslaved people. Stoneware would have been used for putting foodstuffs into, particularly for the winter. So how do we know that enslaved people were actually earning money? Where did they get these objects from? We have accounts from Jefferson's wife, Martha, and from one of his granddaughters, where they record transactions that took place with members of the enslaved community. They're selling things like eggs, chickens, ducks, fish, lettuce, cabbage, potatoes, cucumber, squash, fruits, walnuts, beeswax, baskets, and brooms, all to the Monticello household, and they're receiving money in return. In the upper left, there's a 1 cent coin from excavations at Site 6. And so this is sort of a tangible connection for us that we can see enslaved people earning money and then taking it to market and buying things like buttons, other personal adornment objects like beads, buckles, combs, toothbrushes, thimbles, scissors, and straight pins were needed for maintaining your clothing. At Building S, we have 255 buttons. So that's a lot of buttons for one site. The buttons in the photo are from Site 6, and there's, I think, 54 buttons in that photo. But this is a way for enslaved people to be able to show off a little bit, to have a little bit of personality, agency, and to be able to sort of make something out of slavery and to be able to exist in such a brutal system. So to wrap up and to just underscore the points again, enslaved people were active producers and consumers. And in purchasing objects, there was a large variability among enslaved households in their selection of goods. I hope I've convinced you that archaeology is an important independent source of evidence and doesn't just fill in the gaps of the documentary or the architectural record. And some enslaved households gained more control over their circumstances than others, but this control was at their master's discretion and would have evaporated with their death and sales. So thank you for joining, and I look forward to taking questions at the end.
Thank you, Crystal. Let's see. I've got one last polling question. In 1800, approximately what percentage of the Richmond population was comprised of free Blacks? So of the entire Richmond population, not as a percentage of the Black population. And oops, hang on. Okay, let's see. Okay. So the answers are all over the place. The correct answer is about 10%. And Anna can give more numbers to that. Anna, if you can turn your screen on so we can see you and unmute yourself. I've passed control of the screen to you. And you can talk about Black life in Richmond during the period of slavery. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing this right now. Okay, there you go. Hang on, Anna, take yourself off mute. There you go.
You can hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and you're saying
Oops.
I can,
sorry.
There we go, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so hello everybody, and thank you both to Doug and to Crystal for giving that set of context and obviously direct information and data, because our ability to sort of know what the indoor life of people who lived in houses or structures that don't exist anymore is obviously very difficult, and even more difficult because most people, and I'd say even most of us, don't tend to write about how we've furnished our houses. Maybe a little bit on Instagram when we buy something new, but honestly, we tend to take for granted, our sort of day-to-day lives. And so where we live tends to be what we take for granted in that way to a degree. What I am going to sort of present as a contribution to the conversation is, again, not so much about what was actually on the inside, but maybe a way to think about how people thought about home in this period. So how did, free and enslaved men, women, and children think about their opportunities to create home within a society that really was not very welcoming, or that sought to constrain and proscribe their existence. And one of the things that has sort of bubbled up in my own research of specific people in 18th century and early 19th century Richmond is to begin to have an understanding that some of the people that we talk about as individuals with very particular historical stories actually lived in the same time period and often lived within a few blocks of each other in Richmond. It certainly wasn't a very big town. And so it seemed likely, as we have talked, or in my own work have talked about people like Robert Cowley or Christopher McPherson or Gilbert Hunt, who was known for having saved people from the theater fire in, I think it was 1809, 1807, somewhere in there. Anyway, we tend to think about these very specific tellings of historical stories, and not so much about these people as living in places and being a part of the neighborhood, a part of a community. And so what was the proximity of them to each other and to their work and home and things like that. So I took the opportunity to say that's how I wanted to sort of talk about the interiors and maybe interior lives of people living in this period. So let me see if I can get this to go too far. Here we go. Oops, one more. There we are. So this is my graphic attempt to take a picture of a very long, narrow map and put it together so that we are looking at an 1809 map that was made by Richard Young, who was the City of Richmond surveyor, and had put together, he'd put together some planning maps for Richmond that he would upgrade and improve periodically. This one is specifically the one from 1809. And the main reason that I am attached to this map is because it is the map that for so many years we have looked to for verification of the existence of the quote, burial ground for Negroes down in Shockoe Bottom, which was, of course, the centerpiece of the work of the Sacred Ground Project, as we worked with community members to elevate the history of that burial ground and its relationship to the story of Gabriel's Rebellion, right? And so you can see a pink circle in the middle there. That actually is sort of circling the area along Shockoe Creek where the burial ground once was. And you may notice that it appears to be a fairly undeveloped area in this map. And that's partly because it was a slope along the hillside of Shockoe Hill, but also because it's a reminder that these maps were often depictions of not just what was there, but also what they planned to put there. and also what they were not necessarily interested in recording in that particular moment. So we always have to look at these maps with an understanding that they are created for a purpose. And just because we see something doesn't mean it was there. And just because we don't see something doesn't mean maybe it wasn't there. And when we're talking about sites related to Black people's lives in this period, you really do have to pay attention to maybe what isn't there, what isn't articulated. The sort of cross-haired circles are linked. I'll explain those as we go through the next 3 slides, represent where certain people lived. I picked just 3 people to highlight in this particular presentation because I don't have 2 hours. But I hope to go on and really populate this map with a lot of people whose lives overlapped in this period. And the 2 over here on the right represents places. So the one I'm circling now represents the site of the Henrico Courthouse and City Jail as it existed in 1809, which is at 22nd Street and East Main Street. And up here, I circled that because that's roughly the location of the McDonald's that's in Shockoe Bottom right now and near the gas station. So that's basically 18th Street and East Broad Street. And the reason I highlighted that was because we know about a block or 2 of buildings in that area that were residences for enslaved or free Black people who were living and working in Richmond in that time. One of the common formations in an urban environment is that a block would have sort of business structures on the perimeter of the block, and then on the interior of the block would be what they call tenements. But buildings where people lived, and often it was free Black people, boarding situations, and others. So it's so again, just to describe it so that you understand that this is a living and working area of town. So it's an industrial, commercial part of town, in Shockoe Bottom in particular. And there's going to be a lot of different kinds of occupations that are involved, and residences are going to oftentimes be directly associated with those occupations. And let's go ahead on to the next slide, and I will describe some of these other places in association with the people. I will quickly say that life for free Black people in this period was really not significantly different than lives for enslaved people, in that in the early part, so in the colonial era, Black people living, and after 1619, you have most Black people who come are living in either enslaved or indentured circumstances. But at that time, Virginia had not really entirely codified its social structure for how Blacks and whites would live together in any kind of real solid way, and they weren't sort of planning ahead. They weren't proscribing in advance those conditions. So in that period, you still had the idea that Black people could earn their way to freedom. And that once they were free, they were more or less expected to sort of aspire to live as their white peers would live. An Encyclopedia Virginia entry describes it as living as Black Englishmen. And so there was this idea that society sort of could work that out. And in many ways, that's sort of a small but interesting reference to the fact that most societies in the world experienced many other peoples. If they weren't in terribly remote places, if they were places where trade was conducted from many sort of different areas, then there's plenty of mixing of people. That is more historically accurate than whole societies being entirely isolated and not and with any weird sense of purity. So this idea of, you know, pure people of sort of any place is misleading, because people have always moved around and mixed and become other people. So by the time we get to the 18th century, the 1700s, and the period leading up to the Revolution and the formation of the United States, slavery by this time has really become entrenched. And along with that, the idea that race and slavery go together. So Black people in this period have evolved in white society to be seen as intending to be enslaved people. So that changes the status of free Black people to really kind of a suspect middle layer in society that is kind of tolerated as opposed to encouraged to assimilate and become a part of white society. So this is a real shift. This is when the United States really moves into becoming a racialized society where the white race is intended to be the elevated race, and Black people are not. So it begins to matter, and different people have different experiences, but again, it begins to matter in a real way, and after a while, laws and practices support that as we get through the 19th century and head towards the Civil War. So with that little sort of bit of background, here we are with a character, a man named Robert Cowley. And you can see Cowley's name in the middle here with that little, again, crosshairs. The crosshairs is sitting on a building which in an 1809, which is the same year as the map was created, there was an advertisement in a newspaper that indicated that this lot here between the governor's house and the state capitol, this is because the Capitol grounds had not been created yet, this lot was up for sale, and within the advertisement, it made note of the fact that there were two buildings involved in this lot, and that in one of them, the doorkeeper to the Capitol, Robert Cowley, lived. And so that was very exciting for me doing my research, because suddenly I knew where he lived, at least in 1809. Now, Robert Cowley was a man who was probably only made it into sort of the history books for us to know about, because he had been associated with Gabriel's Rebellion, because someone had basically implicated him as the man who worked at the Capitol building and who had apparently agreed to turn over the keys to the storage where the militia's guns were kept. And those guns would be essential to the success of any attempted rebellion by Gabriel, his brothers, and the coterie of organizers who had been at work for an entire spring and summer to try and bring this thing to fruition. As it turns out, Cowley was interrogated and immediately released back to work at the Capitol. And we, because the rebellion didn't actually end up happening, we will never know if he had agreed to turn over those keys or open the door. He just simply never got that far. So he's interesting for that purpose. But the other thing that makes him interesting really is simply his own life. He was manumitted at the age of over 45 years old in 1785, and had been an enslaved person to the Randolph family in Varina for the bulk of his enslaved life. But then he lived the remainder of his free life in Richmond. And so here he is living in a house right there up on Capitol Square, as we understand it, and it has this position that was a governor's appointment, which he got in 1795. So here he lives on Capitol Hill, basically south of the neighborhood known as Port End. Here's Grace Street, here's Broad Street, here's 9th Street, here's 12th Street. At that time, 12th Street went all the way down to the river. So that was kind of a straight shot. If he wanted to go down and had to do business in Shockoe Bottom, he would head straight down 12th Street and then over. along either Canal or Cary or Main Street into the business district. So we'll just, so that's one person. And if we go back to the first map, he's here, right there in the middle. All right. In the second map, we're going to talk about Lydia Broadnax. And Lydia Broadnax is a fascinating person. Again, I'm describing people whose stories have been told at different times, but again, in isolation from each other. Lydia Broadnax was approximately the same age as Robert Cowley. She may have been 10 years younger, we're not quite sure. She was born in 1741, I think, and Robert Cowley may have been born in the 1740s. He may also have been born in the 1690s because his obituary claims that he died at the age of 125 in the year 1820. But Lydia is clearly, she lives her life between her birth in 1741, I believe, and died in I think it was 1819 that she died. But Lydia Broadnax was a woman who was enslaved by the wife of George Wythe. And many contemporary people may know George Wythe High School, but George Wythe was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a law professor at the College of William and Mary very early on. He taught people like Thomas Jefferson, and many others of that generation who went to law school were taught by George Wythe. George Wythe was anti-slavery, as it turns out. His family did have small farm, but it was relatively small. They may have owned maybe 5 or 6, not more than 10 enslaved people. And when he inherited them, he freed them, he manumitted them. His wife owned enslaved people, and when she passed away very young, he then became their owners and he manumitted them. Lydia Broadnax was one of her enslaved people, and he manumitted her, and she did go on to make a living, I think maybe through her cooking, but she was able to purchase a property with a house on it and used it as income, but she lived in the house of George Wythe. That house was at 5th and Franklin Street. And if any of you have gone to the Secret Sandwich Society, right there on 5th and Grace, that is the corner where the house of George Wythe and Lydia Broadnax once stood. One of the reasons that Lydia Broadnax is also famous or infamous is because she was the lone survivor of the murder of George Wythe and a young man named Michael Brown by George Wythe's nephew, who was impatient to inherit his the money that he was going to inherit from George Wythe upon his death. So he poisoned them one morning, and George Wythe died 8 days later. The young man, Michael Brown, was a mixed race young man that George Wythe was helping along. And the intention was that he would help him with his education and finding a living and basically give him his start in the world. Instead, this young man, George Wythe Sweeney, decided he wanted his money and he wasn't interested in anybody else having it. And so he poisoned them. George Wythe and the young man died. And Mrs. Broadnax did survive, but she did lose a significant of her vision. She became partially blind. This was a notorious case, in part because he was a founding father, as it were, and they brought this young man to court immediately, but he was not convicted because the only witness was the survivor, Lydia Broadnax, and she was an African woman, and Black people's testimony could not be used in court at that time. And what is really interesting to think about that is that George Wythe was really considered just, so important to the cause of the Revolutionary War and independence and the start of the nation. and yet they were not willing to accept this woman's testimony in order to bring his killer, who they knew was the killer, to justice, simply because of her race. So there they are, living at 5th and Gray Street at the same time that Robert Cowley is living here next to the Capitol building. The next person that we're going to talk about is, is Christopher McPherson. And Christopher McPherson is a known character in Richmond at this time. He actually only lived in Richmond between 1800 and about 1811. But during that time, he clerked for most of the political figures in Richmond, probably a lot of the lawyers and businessmen, meaning he wrote up their documents, he kept their books. He was a mixed race man. They know his father was a Scotsman named Charles McPherson. His mother was an enslaved woman in Louisa County whose name was Clarissa. He was later sold to a man named David Ross, who was an extremely prominent businessman in Richmond and owned a lot of property, who educated him and found that he had an aptitude for being a clerk. And so he employed him actually looking after one of his offices, and he oversaw or was the manager of an office that employed, I think, 5 or 6 white men. So he had the skills, and David Ross was willing to put him in that position. He eventually purchased his freedom and actually worked in Philadelphia for a while and did work for and had dinner with people like James Madison. And then he makes his way to Richmond and establishes himself there and begins to acquire property and makes himself known. And so in the course of doing that, he has property. He actually will own property and then sell property in order to establish a free Black cemetery in the northern part of the city, one that ends up being a part of what we now know as the Barton Heights cemeteries. Christopher McPherson is also apparently a religious zealot. And that, along with having the nerve to try to establish a school for Black people and advertising it in the newspaper, may have led to the authorities getting uncomfortable and deciding that he needed to be stopped. And so he was arrested and charged with lunacy. He was convicted and sent to the asylum in Williamsburg. Fortunately, after a month, they determined that he was not insane. And he had letters of support from white prominent men in Richmond and Williamsburg, and so he was released. It cost him some of his property, and he eventually ended up in New York City, and that was where he was when he died. But this property that I have identified here has McPherson's name on it. So these maps often, and in this case, will have the lot number and often records the name of the person that actually owns it. And so this is down here near Carey Street and 13th Street. So an area we know is Shockley Slip, not far from, what's down there? Not far from Fountain Bookstore, if you're familiar with our local independent store down there. So here we have these 3 figures whose, again, stories are typically told separately from each other. We have, nothing, and yet here they are within just blocks of each other, which makes you think that they must at some point have encountered each other. Perhaps they went to the same tavern of an evening. Now, maybe the men and women didn't go together, I don't know. But their day-to-day lives, you have to imagine that there must have been some encounter. And one of the places where that is most likely is the First African Baptist Church, or the First Baptist Church, which allowed Black people to have services in it. Again, this thinking about these people having, lives of their own within the constraints of the society that they live in, while at the same time trying to navigate those constraints, attend church, visit with each other, have people over for dinner, you never know, right? but how to carve out a normal life in these sort of extraordinary circumstances, which for them were in many ways normal circumstances, and how that might affect how they set up the interiors of their homes. So I'll stop there. Oh, I did talk about Robin Spurlock. Sorry, Robin Spurlock was an enslaved man owned by John Marshall, who was admitted at the age of 70. And he lived just north of where Broadnax and Cowley lived. So again, in the neighborhood. And I like to end with this particular quote by Maya Angelou. I just found it, and it's so on point for what I was thinking about. The ache for home lives in all of us, the safe place where we can go as we are and not be questioned. And that's what I tend to think about for enslaved and free Black people in this period. The idea that stability and a place to be home, to be safe, to be your own space, what a premium that must have been for them at that time.
Thank you, Anna. That's a really beautiful quote to end on. So I am going to stop sharing the screen, and I think everyone should hopefully be able to see all 4 of us now. And let's see. We have time for Q&A if anyone has any questions. And I see in the chat, Wait Rawls had, let's see, I think some of these might just be commentary, not necessarily questions, but let's see. Doug, Encyclopedia of Virginia has a slave dwelling on Church Hill. I told Elva that I know that space and doubt seriously that it was a slave dwelling. She had used my house at 2215 East Broad Street as a multiple dwelling place, 5 dwellings, in her talks. It's very similar to the 2-floor photo you used in your introductory slide. And then still for Doug, from Wait. My hypothesis is that the larger slave quarter included housing for the workforce at the owner's tobacco factory on Franklin and 25th Street in Richmond. There was no question in there, but I don't know, Doug, if you had anything that you wanted to respond to that comment, or
well, no, well, I'll contact Wade, and but yeah, he does reinforce there's a wide variety of living arrangements, and sort of Anna got to this some as well, is that, you know, for instance, many enslaved people were hired out in cities, but also in rural areas, and then also lived out from both their owners, their employers. So, you know, had rental lodgings and boarding houses and other places. Yeah, and we see these sort of combinations where there's both hired enslaved workers and others, you know, living in the same places.
And that's actually true at Monticello too. So not in an urban setting, but we do know that Jefferson is renting or leasing enslaved people from his neighbor, John Craven, and is also leasing slaves out as well. So there's a lot of movement, even though it's not in an urban setting, you know, sort of within the local community.
Okay, let's see. Also from Wait, I don't know if you'd heard, but the Yeoman Farm cabin at Appomattox, or APPX, I'm assuming Appomattox, there's some evidence that it was originally a slave cabin and then inhabited by a white family. I'm not sure I ever believed that. I think that's to Anna.
Because I work there. And that, you know, yeah, so we can talk about that off. But I will say that because I have given tours at the Confederate president's house, right, up on Clay Street, just to again add to the idea that within that house, Jefferson Davis and Verena Davis had enslaved people working there. They had free Black people working there who were paid. They had immigrants, 2 Irish women and 1 German man who were employed there. And they also had many, many people escaping and taking their freedom and getting the heck out of there. And so there really, there was sort of the full range of experience in terms of the range of classes of servants in that house that they participated in. He hired locally as well as purchased and brought people in. So, yeah.
Thank you, Anna. Crystal, were enslaved people ever allowed to keep possessions when they were sold?
Good question. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't want to, I'm not sure would be my honest response, but I suspect on occasion they were allowed to take possessions in a sack, for instance. There was a great book that came out last year or 2 years ago called All That She Carried. It's a story about a cloth sack that ended up at the National Museum in DC, and it has not an inscription, an embroider, sort of the story of women, how this cloth sack got passed down from generations. And the cloth started out in slavery and ended up in freedom eventually at this museum. So it's a really neat story. We do have an example from Building O in one of the subfloor pits along Mulberry Row. There's a stash of Chinese porcelain plates that seem to have just been left for some reason. And to me, it's kind of evocative of perhaps the residents of that building were forced to leave very quickly and had to leave those plates behind. And so it's kind of a workaround to that question. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
Let's see. Are there any artifacts that show young children lived in these spaces? And I'm going to ask two questions actually, because they're pretty similar. So one was, are there any artifacts that show that young children lived in these spaces? And another question that said, do we know of any differences between the spaces of enslaved people of different ages within a home? For example, did kids do different things than the adults?
Yeah, so childhood during this time period sort of looked like adulthood, and kids weren't. They didn't have. They were put to work basically as soon as they were able. Jefferson had boys as young as 10 working in a nailery, which would have just been brutal, especially in the summer. And these are kids, right? 10 years old is quite young to be doing manual, very physical labor. So to answer the first question, as far as what artifacts have we found that are sort of associated with childhood and the way that we understand it today, I thought to do it and then I didn't include, we do have doll parts, so porcelain doll parts that are almost certainly, they would have belonged to children. And some of the games, dominoes, I think adults would have played too, marbles probably would have been played by adults, but kids certainly could have done those tasks as well. I think young girls were probably taught how to sew and mend from a very early age. We do have evidence from different archaeological sites, smaller thimbles, for instance, that would have been for either very petite women or young girls. So children probably would have helped with washing on wash day and would have done a lot of the tasks that perhaps women, grandmothers who were given their time, meaning they didn't have to work in the agricultural fields, but they were sort of in charge of watching the children while mom or dad were laboring out in the fields. They probably would have helped grandma with a lot of tasks that they had to. Yeah, good questions.
Thank you. Anna, I'm going to go back. I see you answered this in the thing already, but I thought it was a really good question. Someone asked about the actual population of Richmond that was free Blacks and was questioning the 10% number and asked if that was just one period of time or throughout slavery. And I know there's lots of different numbers over time, and just thought maybe you could talk to the audience for a minute about some of those.
Yeah, no, it actually is kind of interesting. When I was, looking through the census records and sort of trying to unpack, the character of free Black life in Richmond, in Virginia, it was surprisingly consistent. The population is certainly growing. We're not, we're looking at, I want to say, close to 12,000 Black people living in Richmond at the start of the Civil War. about 10% or about 20% of that 12,000 were free Black people. So 20% of the Black population tended to be free, but of the total population, it tended to be closer to 10%. And that did seem to hold consistent from very early Richmond to again through the end of slavery.
Thank you. Let's see. Doug, I'm going to ask you this one. Can you describe the changes, if any, in the homes of formerly enslaved Blacks during Reconstruction?
We can, because in some cases we know that the enslaved people who were, say, on a given plantation, they ended up in the same buildings in the post-Civil War era, in some cases, often as tenant farmers, tenant workers on. So in some cases they stayed in the same buildings. What's also interesting, my colleague and I, Dennis Pogue, have recorded a couple of purposely built tenant houses that were built after the Civil War that really follow this duplex models. They're slightly different materials, different technology of sawing and nails, etc. But they're the same 2-room format, being built, in this case, for free Blacks as workers on these farms and plantations. We also see what happens sometimes is duplexes, which were, I said, 2 enslaved household, become a single household. And so, for instance, they'll insert doorways through the partitions. They'll take out one of the stairs in one room because you only need one set of stairs to get upstairs. So we see those distinct changes made, in the post-Civil War era, as those buildings are, those slave quarters are turned into housing for free people.
Okay, thank you, Doug. We are pretty much at 7:30, so I am going to say thank you and good night to everyone. If you have any more questions, there are some people, and I don't know, who are raising their hand, and if you want to submit your comment in the question or chat, I can take it, but I'm gonna not be switching permission so that panelists or attendees can answer. But I just wanted to acknowledge all the people that are raising their hand in the audience.
Danielle, are you gonna forward those to us? Be happy to answer people.
I see Margot Williams, and there was someone else who had been raising their hand to.
I thought if you could forward their emails or whatever. Yeah.
If they email me, they're just raising their hand in the chat.
Oh, okay.
But please feel free to email me at dporter@historicrichmond.com if you have any questions, and I will pass them on to the panelists, or right before I close out, if you send them in, I will pass them along too. So Anna, Crystal, Doug, thank you so much for this evening. This was wonderful and very informative, and I will be in touch. Great. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.